In Vienna, there is a story about a man who lost his head and never left. According to legend, he still walks the streets of the old town, not searching, not speaking, just wondering. Because whatever happened to him didn't end with his death. The story is set in Vienna's old town, in the narrow streets that still exist today. Places people walk through every day without thinking twice, which makes it slightly more unsettling. Because if the story is to be believed, this is exactly where he was last seen. Welcome to Of Mountains and Men, where we explore documented myths, mysteries, and legends from the Alps and beyond. Tonight, we stay in Vienna and follow one of its darker stories. The man at the center of the story is said to have been a baker, which at first doesn't sound particularly threatening. Bread, after all, is not generally associated with horror. But in medieval cities, bakers were important figures. They worked at night, supplying food for entire neighborhoods. Their ovens burned while the rest of the city slept. And their work was strictly regulated. Because bread was not just food, it was survival. Prices were controlled, weights were inspected, and those who cheated faced serious consequences. Which brings us to the baker in this story. Because according to legend, he did exactly that. The story goes that the baker began to cheat his customers, selling bread that was underweight, cutting corners, keeping more for himself. At a time where people relied on every loaf, it didn't go unnoticed. Complaints were made. Inspections followed. And eventually, the authorities intervened. Now, medieval punishments were not subtle. They were designed to be seen. They sent a message. And in this case, the punishment was severe. According to the story, the baker was executed publicly and decisively. He lost his head, which one might assume would be the end of the story. But in Vienna, it rarely is. In Vienna, executions were carried out publicly, often outside the city walls. One of the most well-known execution sites was the Wienerberg area, where sentences were carried out in view of witnesses. These events were not hidden. They were meant to be seen, to demonstrate authority, and to reinforce the rules that governed everyday life. Executioners themselves held a strange position in society. They were necessary, but often avoided. Somewhat respected for their role, yet socially isolated. And their work, like the punishments they carried out, was meant to leave a lasting impression. Not long after his execution, people began to talk. At first, quietly. A figure seen late at night, moving through the streets. Something not quite right. And then the detail that turned rumor into legend. He had no head. Witnesses described a man walking where the baker once lived and worked. Headless, silent. Passing through the same streets he had known in life. Some claimed he carried something in his hands. Others said he simply walked, repeating the same path again and again. Now, whether these were real sightings or stories shaped by fear and imagination, it is difficult to say. But the location remained consistent. The old town, its narrow streets, places that still exist today, which is always where these stories become a little more uncomfortable. Stories like this rarely survive because there is some kind of proof. They survive because they are repeated, because they carry something simple and memorable. A warning, a consequence, a figure that represents what happens when trust is broken. And in that sense, the headless baker becomes more than a person. He becomes a symbol, one that is easy to remember and difficult to forget. From a historical perspective, stories like this are not unusual. Medieval cities were full of cautionary tales, especially ones involving tradespeople. Bakers, butchers, merchants, anyone responsible for essential goods. Because trust mattered. And breaking that trust had consequences. Public punishment reinforced those rules. But stories went further. They ensured the message lasted. Not just in law, but in memory. A dishonest baker is punished. A dishonest baker returns. And suddenly, the lesson becomes harder to ignore. Whether or not anyone truly saw a headless figure, the story itself served a purpose. Though, admittedly, it is a fairly dramatic way to encourage honest baking. Even today, Vienna's old town changes at night. The crowds thin, the streets quiet, and the city feels different. The same buildings, the same paths, but without the noise of the day. And in places like that, it becomes easier to understand how stories like this begin. Or why they never quite disappear. The Headless Baker of Vienna may never have walked those streets again, but the story did. And it stayed, passed from one generation to the next, quietly, persistently, until it became part of the city itself. Just another reminder that in Vienna, history and legend are rarely far apart.